Hey, listeners, and welcome to the You Are Epic podcast. This is where we honour the people who've helped build not just our industry, but our communities. I'm Angela Hucker, and I am so glad that you're here. So, I'm taking the time to sit down with people who've been in construction for years, people who've been through the ups, the downs, and everything in between. You're going to hear real stories of resilience, growth, and moments that shaped who they are. This podcast is for those that want to learn more from people who've been walking this path for some time, and they're helping to lift up others and quietly making a difference along the way. It's also to show you that your journey matters and your voice matters. And in case you've forgotten, you are epic. Let's get into it. Today's guest is Alberto Melgoza, a leader in strategic communication, governance, and building reputation leadership. Alberto helps executive teams and organisations manage risk, protect their reputation, and stay steady when the pressure's on, especially in high stakes environments where public trust, regulation, and stakeholder expectations collide. From crisis management to government relations and internal cultural alignment, Alberto's the person that leaders call when the stakes are high and the path forward needs to be clear, defensible, and trusted. His work bridges from the boardroom to the front lines, helping to guide negotiations, shape messaging, and build long-term stability. With a really calm and analytical approach and deep experience across multiple industries, Alberto brings a clear blend of sharp thinking and steady leadership, helping organisations lead with clarity, especially when it matters most. Our next guest is Alberto, who is awesome. Alberto and I connected on LinkedIn and we've had some really great conversations. And Alberto, I have a lot of respect for what you do because I understand you're working in a space that's not easy, with being able to work with different companies addressing their psychosocial hazards, which is obviously a new thing with legislation that's come out under the Workplace Health and Safety Act. So what we might do to start with is maybe if you can just share how many years of experience you've got, how you've sort of got into that space of dealing with psychosocial hazards and, a little bit about your career journey, if you wouldn't mind sharing.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be speaking with you, Angela. And what you do is inspiring in the construction industry. And that's the reason I am trying to support as much as I can. There are issues within the construction industry in terms of psychosocial hazards and risks, of course, but also, as you're aware, and having the thorough experience in the industry, gender issues, right? Women struggle in that industry, but also men. So delighted to be connected with you and happy to help as much as I can.
Mhm.
So my career and my journey, well, I started working in the corporate world very early in my career when I was a teenager, actually. And I had the opportunity to work as executive secretary, if that's the right word, PA, and then moving to executive officer from this biggest oil company in Mexico. From there, I was able to observe and understand many issues about governance and many issues of organizational dynamics that affect the operations of the business and the management. And because of that, when I moved to Australia, I decided to do research into culture, climate, but most importantly, into gender. But why gender? Because in that role in this Mexican oil company, I saw my mom, who was a union leader, how she suffered from a male-dominated industry and how she was struggling every day to raise ideas. And although she was supported by being offered this leadership role, still there was a struggle for her. And I always wonder why. Why is that struggle instead of full 100% support? That's the reason I decided to explore these areas when I was in Australia. I explored in detail aggression, gender identity, gender self-categorization, emotion, prejudice, culture, and climate. At the same time, while I was doing that work, I was doing consulting with many organizations in the field of risk and psychosocial risk that nowadays is legislated and regulated, but back then it was just possibly only the bullying and harassment was legislated, not even regulated. And I was contracted to do investigations and work associated with bullying, harassment, sexual harassment for many years, and also assisted organizations into how to improve performance, how to understand risk better, well-being in many areas. That lasted for approximately 13 years. And then I got an opportunity with the oil company, the largest oil company in the world, arguably, in Saudi Arabia, where they needed assistance with culture and culture transformation. So I helped them for 7 years and a half, from 2013, 2020, I think, to half of 2020. And I was very successful with that type of help. I helped them to transform their culture. I helped them to transform from a quasi-government organization to an IPO. So it was a very successful intervention. It was time to move on, come back to Australia because of family commitments, and they wanted to come back, which is fair enough. From there, I decided to continue with my business. I received some calls from the USA and the Middle East to help them with risk management, which I did. And then I've been helping organizations with psychosocial risks too. Currently, I'm helping the Department of Education with psychosocial risks. So that's a brief history of my background and a little bit of my passion indirectly telling.
That's an incredible journey. And, like I can see how it's kind of something that's happened with your mum, and you've recognized something with your mum, how it kind of set you on a path of, being able to make a difference for others and helping with, looking at the risks and helping people with the culture and the risk and the well-being and those sorts of aspects of a workplace. So that's incredible, and it's certainly an element that's lacking and much needed. When you talk about the risks and the psychosocial stuff, what sort of things do you see that seem to happen like fairly common with your consulting side that you do, and with the types of large companies that you've been involved in? Is there a reoccurring pattern that seems to be happening?
I think from a psychosocial risk perspective, since starting to work in this area a long time ago in the early 2000s, what I can see is a lack of understanding of what truly control is for the organization, of coercive control, if I might say. Also, lack of management, which is an important aspect, which is different than lack of leadership. So management is an issue that organizations, stakeholders, especially those who are in leadership positions, they need to understand what good management is about, especially human resource management, and then also improve at the same time the leadership aspects, right? So I think one of the aspects that I have identified is that leadership is not there. Management needs to improve, but also an understanding of what are the consequences for individuals when they are targeted subtly and directly. Any type of wrongful behavior, bullying, sexual harassment, conflict. So people don't understand the consequences for other people that are suffering that behavior. If people have that little empathy and understanding of what are the consequences, they might think about the way they do business, right? Because people suffer daily, and few instances that suffering turns a fatality of suicide, for instance, which is unfortunate but a reality.
And so when you talk about the lack of management and lack of leadership, what does that actually kind of look like as an example with some instances that you've observed in your time?
So, for instance, in relation to management, understanding what is procedural justice, for instance, what are the right processes? Is the right governance implemented within your organization that allows you to make the right decisions, not only for the business, but for the human resources, right? So if the governance is not implemented properly, which involves proper communication of the policies and the processes and the standards, then you are kind of letting yourself making the decisions on your own on what is the right thing for you and your area, your unit, your department, your organization. Even though there might be some governance and some policies, for instance, if you are not aware of them and you don't follow them, then there's high risk in the sense that there's poor management, and then there's high risk in the decisions that you're making, which are reflected maybe in turnover by staff, in wrongful behavior by staff, in many aspects, right, that happen in the organization every day. Now, from a leadership perspective, leading is, I think, a very important aspect of any organization and differs from management in the sense that even though you have the right governance and you have the right processes and the right standards, you still have to lead people to success because we are all different, we're all diverse, and we all have some strengths and we all have some weaknesses. So leadership is to find the strengths and the weaknesses and make that people feel, or that staff member feel motivated, find meaningful in work. That's
Yeah.
leadership for me, which differs from management.
So if you could, that leading to success, which I love that because, as leaders, that's what we're actually here to do. We're actually here to help lead people to success and lift others up. And the whole thing is actually to create future leaders by sharing our knowledge to then be able to impart it to the people coming behind us as well. Because at the end of the day, a good leader wants everyone else to be a leader as well. And one of the things that I have learned is leadership is a behavior. It's not a position, but you do have people in leadership positions who have that ability to influence at a greater scale as well, because they're the decision makers. So with your comment about leading to success, what does a successful workplace or success look like for you if you were to walk into a company and given the experience that you've got with being able to find the hazards and, the well-being and all of that sort of stuff. If you were to walk into a company and they were doing everything right, they've got their governance in place and it was a successful business, what would they be doing to create that success?
For strong leadership, for me, a reflection of strong leadership to make success happening is actually creating a sense of ownership for staff members that they own that corporation. They work hard for that corporation to succeed. That's one aspect, sense of ownership. Another aspect for success, making that workplace and that individual meaningful. So when I go to work every day, it's a meaningful day for me where I feel rewarded. And that reward is not only financial, which is very important, but also meaningful internally. I feel that I have succeeded in delivering something to that organization that is valuable. For that to happen is not only leadership, but there's also other avenues, such as if you have an idea and that idea is raised to the right channels, then applying that idea and then make that idea happening that is for success for that organization, which hardly happens right, in any organization. So there are many avenues, but sense of ownership, creating that workplace meaningful, respect of any background. We are all diverse, regardless of the race and gender. We are all diverse. So creating a sense of respect is very important in that workplace. If we don't encourage respect, then it is very difficult to create a meaningful day. And it is extremely difficult to influence sense of ownership because the more disrespectful is that environment, the less you want to be there. So the less sense of ownership and the more carelessness. Those are three aspects that I think are very critical for a strong leader, right?
So the sense of ownership, meaningful work, being rewarded and being respected, like I totally agree with that as well. I think that's something that's valuable for any work environment. So when you link that to particularly the psychosocial hazards and risks, how does that kind of correlate? Because having that on one side, but then knowing that there's psychosocial hazards and risks with bullying and discrimination and harassment that's actually happening, there's a bit of a disconnect there in work environments because you've got these issues happening, and then that would directly be impacting on people having sense of ownership, being respected. Because if people were being respected, they wouldn't be harassed, they wouldn't be bullied, they wouldn't be discriminated against. So have you got any ideas or suggestions as to how that could be flipped around?
I totally agree that lacking what I am suggesting is actually a hazard, right? We can consider them a psychosocial hazard, right? So the lack of leadership is a psychosocial hazard. It's not a hazard that the codes of practice of different states and Comcare will recommend, but for me, lack of leadership is a hazard, clearly. Poor or toxic work culture is another psychosocial hazard, and lack of governance, which is a procedural issue, is another psychosocial hazard that is well established within the codes in different states and Comcare. So while bullying may be the result of culture, sometimes it's not culture, it's just the individual.
Mm.
And in that regard, the priority is to have a risk framework that incorporates psychosocial risks such as bullying or hazards, that in some instances is what are the controls to prevent bullying to happen. Because if it's the individual and not the workplace, it's extremely difficult to have that hierarchy of controls for that, right? Because you cannot eliminate the hazard, right? But you can
Mm.
prevent it in many ways, doing your risk assessments or right investigations when convenient, when needed, then will allow you to understand what controls and what actions you need to do to eliminate those hazards, right? But to answer your question, yeah, lack of leadership, lack of management is a psychosocial hazard. Therefore, I think we have these regulations and legislation where,
Mm.
although very new, sooner or later, corporations will need to understand that a way to prevent the risk to materialize is to work on your leadership, improve your governance, improve decision making,
Mm.
make better management at work. Organizations will have to understand that that's the way forward with this legislation and this regulation.
Yeah, no, and thank you for sharing. That's awesome advice. So with the companies that you're consulting to in this space, how receptive are you finding them with being able to implement these changes so that there is a compliance element there to be able to comply with the legislation, which is to eliminate or reduce the psychosocial hazards? Are they
Sure.
open to it? Are they kind of a bit hesitant? Is it kind of like, yeah, this is all good and it's all in paper, but what's the effectiveness of being able to implement and ensure that it's being adhered to as well?
Sure, absolutely. Great question. I think that this is a fact. The fact is that different corporations, different businesses, either small, medium, large, their operations are very different to what they need to comply with. If you go to the oil and gas, well, their role is to extract petroleum and gas from the ground and sell it. Different organizations have different operations and they have different concerns. So arguably, the better you manage your psychosocial risks and hazards, the better performance you will have from an operating perspective, right? Easier said than done because of the priority, which is the operations of the business. Sometimes key aspects of legislation and regulation and the required compliance are not taken due. I think it is unfortunately is reactive more than proactive, right? So when something happens, then you actually hopefully organizations are more proactive in the way they can see that managing psychosocial hazards and risks is helpful and can be actually even better for the returns from an operating perspective. There are key factors that are embedded now within any business, which is physical safety, for instance. If you go to the construction industry or any type of industry, physical safety is a priority, right? But now organizations, they need to realize that there's not only physical safety and health, but also psychosocial safety and
Mm.
health. So for that, there's a lot of transformation required in your health and safety management system, in your risk management system and frameworks, in the way your governance needs to change to reflect those issues. So there's a lot of work involved in those
Mm.
areas. At the same time, your priority is to provide returns of whatever your operations are. There is awareness that they need to work on it, but it is a slow process because you have to change a lot of things from your systems. The transformation is important and requires financial resources, human resources. Although there's awareness that you need to tackle these, I think it might take time.
Yeah, and that's something that I've recognized as well as like it's that initial investment before you get the ROI as well, because there is those financial and human resources needed up front to be able to get someone like you to come in and do that gaps analysis and provide the systems of what they need to create that good governance and everything before they can implement something to then get the ROI on that. So
Exactly.
yeah, so there's
Exactly.
the outlay first before you get the return. So are you finding that this might be a bit of a challenge for companies with being able to do that as well? Because obviously the legislation's come in and it's kind of like companies now, they need to comply with that legislation, but then it's like, well, what do we do? So are you finding that's a bit of a barrier and maybe a bit of a blocker or a challenge for companies knowing what the path forward is with what they need to do?
Absolutely. I think although they are aware that this is legislator and regulator, is a big challenge because from a corporate perspective, also who owns this? Is this because
Mm.
psychosocial hazards, they are diverse also, right? So the codes, they provide examples of some psychosocial hazards, but then corporations may have different psychosocial hazards that are not within the code. And those hazards may be in different areas of operations. They might be in health and safety, they might be in HR, they might be in the operations per se, they might be in the executive team. So who owns that? There's complexity within corporations to understand the many links internally and the many relationships internally associated with psychosocial risks and assets. First requires that awareness, then who will own this, and then what's the budget required to build these so we can comply effectively. But I think the most important factor is not the compliance, but preventing psychosocial harm. More important than the harm and the compliance is the well-being of the staff member, right?
Mm.
So those are the key factors that I think corporations need to understand. Preventing harm, how can we enhance well-being, and then how can we comply effectively? For that to happen, there's important internal transformation that is not there yet, I think, within the systems. Is fully understood because there's a strong difference between psychological hazard versus psychosocial hazard, right? So that's also kind of confusing.
So do you want to touch on that and just, maybe share what those differences are for people to have a bit better understanding as well?
Sure. Sure. I mean, an important difference is that psychosocial harm is not only psychological, it's also financial, it's also reputational, it's also relationship wise. There are many aspects that affect the harm is to your work, to your family, that are not necessarily psychological.
Mm.
Now, psychological is more into the harm that has caused you from a psychological perspective. The stress, the anxiety, depression, binge eating, alcoholism, lack
Mm.
of sleep. Psychosocial is more broader than psychological. That's a way to differentiate the both.
So it could be kind of intrinsic versus extrinsic.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah,
Intrinsic and extrinsic factors. Psychosocial harm can be intrinsic and extrinsic, and psychological is mainly intrinsic.
yeah.
Now, in some aspects, the psychosocial harm, if there's financial psychosocial harm, you can actually measure that easily and be objective in that measurement. Unlike psychosocial harm, which could have been out of a psychosocial hazard, the psychosocial harm is very subjective. If I am telling Angie that I have a trauma out of an experience that I have from a
Mm.
hazard, it's extremely difficult to quantify the level of harm,
Mm.
right? And to heal that is also extremely difficult. It's up to me to find the ways to heal that harm, and it might take forever. I might not be
Yeah,
able to heal it. So,
yeah,
very important differences between psychosocial harm, psychosocial hazards, and psychological harm and psychological risk, if I
yeah.
might say.
So I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball out there right now.
Sure, sure.
So one thing that I have noticed, I won't say it's a common practice, but I have heard of it happening a little bit, and I've got a few friends who've been directly impacted. But for me, it comes back to this harm, the well-being, the governance. And when people have actually raised some concerns, specifically in regards to bullying and harassment, so your psychosocial hazards, and this is where the governance comes in. Companies have generally taken the easy route in that instead of investigating the incident, because of the potentially the position of the person who has created the hazard in the first place, their position is more highly valued than the person who has been inflicted the harm. And as a result, companies are actually I call it the silencing campaign, but they're providing the person who's been inflicted with the harm non-disclosure agreements and payouts. So a shut up and pay them out. And I'm not sure if you've seen that in your time or come across things like that. In those instances where it's like providing someone with a non-disclosure agreement when they've raised an issue of being bullied or harassed and then paying them out, how do you think companies could better manage that to be able to manage their obligation that they've got and not inflict more harm onto the individual?
So this is a very important aspect, right? So we have discussed some differences and concepts about psychosocial risk and psychosocial harm. And then we also discussed the importance possibly of a risk assessment from a psychosocial perspective. But then this aspect is different and is also very important. It's part of the regulation and part of the legislation, right? Doing the right investigations after an incident is raised. Now, from a governance perspective, corporations need to understand and find out or decide the severity of bullying or the severity of sexual harassment, for instance. So for me, sexual harassment, bullying, any type of harassment is severe. There's no levels of,
Yeah.
right? So for me, it is severe regardless. Once an incident of bullying, sexual harassment is raised, first, what I recommend to any corporation is to acknowledge the issue. And then once you acknowledge the issue, you need to investigate. So this is about ethics and morale. Even though you do an investigation and the results showing you clear evidence of wrongdoing by someone that is an important stakeholder within your corporation, you need to implement what your governance, your code of conduct, your code of ethics indicate. Then you're doing the right thing. We are following our processes. We are following the legislation. We have notified the regulator in accordance to the legislation because it's a serious incident. Whatever you find in that fair investigation and the actions you have decided, do those actions. But if you do an NDA and you pay out someone that's not within your code of conduct and your code of ethics and other governance processes, then I think the corporation needs to work on that governance better because then the decision making is not related to the governance. So there's an issue. That in itself is a psychosocial hazard, right? That lack of procedural justice is a clear psychosocial hazard, right? So therefore, if you have a code of conduct, if you have a code of ethics, you have other processes and policies that specifically tell what you need to do after you do an investigation based on these incidents, you need to make the decision based on what these documents suggest. If you don't, then you are breaking your own governance, right? Which is not good.
But then it comes to the point of who's holding them accountable.
It's a complex issue, right? It really depends on possibly that person that suffered the bullying and sexual harassment received a payout that is good enough that that person feels that the problem is solved, but possibly not. And if the corporation has done the right process, it's up to that person before signing any NDA to decide what to do.
So just like we've got the legislation that's come in, and obviously that's taken a long time because that only came in 2023 with the the changes with the Workplace Health and Safety Act to acknowledge specifically the psychosocial hazards. And then there was further legislation around sexual harassment as well. So if you were to consider this from a legislative perspective, is there something pie in the sky that you think might actually help hold the companies more accountable? Because again, it comes back to their code of ethics and their code of conduct. But if the people who've created the harm in the first place aren't ethical and don't have good conduct, who's holding them to account? And that's where, do you think there's something perhaps from a legislative perspective that might help? And I know Victoria was looking at the prohibition of NDAs for sexual harassment cases. I'm just curious, with your expertise and knowledge, if you think there's something there that might be able to assist.
Sure. Before going into the procedural justice, I think it's important to discuss sexual harassment, right? Sexual harassment is a horrible behavior So sexual harassment is trying to control and humiliate the person that you're harassing sexually. The lack of possibly self-esteem or lack of self-confidence or whatever that person grew up with, and that insecurities that person has allows that person to sexually harass another person because they're trying to control. So that's an important factor to understand. When we understand those things, we create a governance and a risk management framework that tackles psychosocial risks and hazards and considers sexual harassment as an important hazard. So you need to tackle the coercive control, the humiliation, and then you can tackle the procedural justice.
Mm.
So how you can tackle that is, in my view, through the code of conduct. So when I review code of conduct, they are not comprehensive enough to tackle these issues of humiliation, coercive control, which lead to sexual harassment, even bullying. You need to improve your governance by improving your codes of conduct. You need to improve your code of ethics. You need to improve your policies, your standards. Without improving that, it's extremely difficult then to do the procedural justice because you have no framework to tackle these things. But once you have, in case you have a robust code of conduct, code of ethics, and standards and processes, then you can start doing your risk assessments as appropriate, proactive rather than reactive. And then, in case you have found signs of sexual harassment, then investigate the issue and create actions. What corporations need to understand is, how can I prevent sexual harassment from happening? First is my governance, understanding the legislation, of course, but then is constant communication, internal processes that every day, constantly communicating your code of conduct, the consequences. What corporations do, which I think is not good enough, is they just promote it. There's a promotion in the one day, in International Women's Day, for instance, and we promote it. A We Okay Day, we promote it, and then that's it. Now, it is every day. And
Mm.
every single email should have issues, for instance, about sexual harassment and how we're tackling it, right?
Mm.
And what are the innuendos to understand sexual harassment, right? What is sexual harassment? What is not? It's kind of your operations, as well as you are extracting oil and gas from the earth every day, and you cannot stop those operations. As well, you cannot stop communicating internally these psychosocial risks and hazards
Mm.
every day. So
Mm.
it should be your priority.
Mm. Yeah, and it's kind of that constant, well, it's that reinforcement. And to me, like, as a bit of an analogy, it's like you don't go to the gym and work out once for 10 minutes and suddenly you've got a six pack. It's that constant repetition of going to the gym every day, doing the
Exactly.
workouts, and this sort of stuff needs to be the same approach, that you can't just write a
Exactly.
policy or have your code of conduct or your code of ethics
Exactly.
and there you go. You've got all your words on paper, and then the document just goes in the drawer if there's no reinforcement after the fact.
Correct. So how do you reinforce these? You reinforce these through emails, because people normally read emails every day. People are normally in teams work every day. So you reinforce in teamwork, you reinforce it. Before every chat, you have a message there. And I love it. Now, every time we have an opening or any talk or any conversation, we acknowledge the indigenous communities. So as well as acknowledging them, we need to acknowledge sexual harassment, bullying, the same. So it
Mm.
might take 10 minutes to open your speech or to open the conference, but that's the only way, right? But it's extremely difficult. Yeah, even though you communicate every day, people have their own, their own behaviors, their own ways, their own values, and so you always have to be vigilant and have open doors and investigate properly. It requires also a lot of not only the acknowledgement, which is very important, but a lot of caring and compassion when you're doing that investigation. And that caring and compassion is for both. Although we are talking someone that actually sexually harassed someone, that person might be also suffering. So there's a lot of compassion required. There's a lot of confidentiality required, privacy required.
Mm.
conflict of interest required. In a corporation, if you're doing this type of investigations, once an incident is raised, that conflict of interest is clearly there. So you
Mm.
need to have someone outside the corporation to do the investigation, and that professional doing the investigation to follow the confidentiality, the human rights, all the different aspects, and then being completely autonomous on the way those outcomes are made or presented to that organization, and provide recommendations in accordance to the codes and whatever is in place. So I think from a procedural justice perspective, I would recommend organizations first to investigate. So for bullying, harassment, sexual harassment, there's no levels of. I think for me it's severe. So if I raise an issue with Angela that I've been bullied, that's severe for
Mm.
me enough. I
Mm.
don't I don't need a level, but some organizations may require some level of severity. I don't know. For me, it's severe enough. So what I need to do from a legislation and regulatory perspective is notify the regulator, and then once I notify the regulator, I do a thorough investigation. Should I do the investigation with someone internal doing that investigation? No, because the conflict of interest is there. You need to have someone externally doing the investigation,
Mm.
and then allowing those people that are investigated the most compassion and the most confidentiality and human rights available.
Mm.
And then your outcomes and recommendations should be as objective as possible.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the only way that it's going to happen effectively is if it is kept autonomous and someone
So,
completely independent and impartial and non-biased, and they
correct,
haven't got a direct, um,
correct,
like a direct impact of whatever decision there is because they're
correct.
an employee, for example. So, yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. So,
So correct, because the conflict of interest is clear. If within your governance that's not reflected, you have to fix these things. So challenges that corporations have, I think, is that the governance is not robust enough, no matter the size of that corporation, right?
mm,
So they have a code of conduct. Yeah, we have a code of conduct, but is that code of conduct thorough enough? Is that standard thorough enough? Is your conflict of interest policy thorough enough? You have an ethics code. Is that ethics code thorough enough?
mm,
So there's a lot of work to be done in this area before you can actually then operate psychosocial risks, hazards, and the different aspects associated with these psychosocial issues. They will not be done properly if this is not done adequately.
mm. Great advice. So if you were to round this all out as, like a final closing, what would you like to say, or what would you like to share, or a comment or a statement or anything like that that you'd like to say as a final closing?
Sure. I think businesses, corporations, I think at the end of the day, they're trying to do the right thing in a sense that they're doing business. Their priority is to have a return on that investment and make a profit at the end of the day, or deliver the service. What they need to understand is that for that profit making or delivery of good service, or whatever is your main outcome as a business, if you have your adequate governance and you treat people in relation to that governance in detail, right? Because that's what it is. You have that governance is for the reason of making decisions that comply with your governance, then you will have no issues in complying with legislation or regulation. You may have issues with bullying, harassment, and sexual harassment, yet, but you will be able to manage the process of dealing with those issues better and with a better outcome for both individuals rather than what is happening now, which is somehow bad in my view. What you're suggesting, there's NDAs and then you
Mm,
pay out. It's not a process that is fair, compassionate, and
mm.
ethical.
So have the good governance and pair it with care and compassion.
Yeah, the good governance is a priority because it allows you to have the good management that require good management, care and compassion, of course, and understanding what good leadership is, right? the key priority, governance, compassion, caring. Indeed.
Love it. Love it. Thank you so much. That's awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this episode today. I hope this conversation gave you something that you can take with you, whether it be a little bit of insight, inspiration, or maybe just a reminder that you're not alone. If it resonated with you, please share, because we're better when we help build each other up. And remember that your experience, your story, and your journey, it all matters more than you know. Until next time, stay kind, stay connected, and never forget, you are epic.